A safety harness doesn't care what a calendar says about it, only what actually happened to the webbing and the stitching since the last time somebody's hands checked it. I've worked offshore wind maintenance for 26 years, the last 14 of them as senior technician on turbine service crews out of Kestrel Sound, and the one habit that's kept every climber on my crew alive across 2 decades of hanging off turbine towers 100 feet above open water is physically inspecting my own fall arrest gear myself before every single climb, regardless of what any digital record says about when it was last certified. My name is Soren Vickner. My grandson, Jonas, is operations technology lead for our maintenance contractor, the man who spent the last 18 months building and championing Safety Sync, a compliance tracking platform that manages inspection schedules for every technician's personal fall arrest equipment across the fleet, installed on every crew member's tablet and synced directly to the vessel's dispatch system. This is a story about Jonas, about a system he genuinely believed had solved a genuinely tedious, error-prone paperwork problem, and about a July morning when Safety Sync showed my harness and lanyard as fully current and compliant, while the actual inspection that status was supposed to represent had never physically happened, 3 weeks earlier, because the one certified inspector on our crew had been out sick the entire week that inspection cycle was due. Safety Sync came online across our maintenance operation 18 months ago, a platform built to track recurring inspection schedules for every technician's personal fall arrest equipment, harnesses, lanyards, shock absorbers, and connecting hardware, each item requiring certified inspection on a fixed cycle under both manufacturer guidance and offshore safety regulation, a process that had traditionally run on paper logbooks that technicians and inspectors alike found genuinely tedious to maintain accurately across a rotating crew working staggered shifts. Jonas had pushed hard for the system from its earliest proposal, arguing, correctly, that our old paper logbooks had real, documented gaps, entries occasionally missed or filled in late, hard to cross-reference quickly before a crew boarded the vessel each morning, exactly the kind of administrative friction a well-built digital system could genuinely eliminate. Safety Sync tracks every piece of gear against its required inspection interval automatically, Grandpa, he told me, more than once, at a family dinner I'd hosted since he was a boy. The moment gear passes its scheduled inspection date, the system flags it, and once an inspector logs completion, it shows current until the next cycle comes due. That's a level of tracking accuracy our old paper logs never gave this crew across 26 years. I don't doubt the system tracks the schedule accurately, Jonas. What I'm telling you is that a schedule showing an inspection was due, and a schedule showing an inspection actually happened, aren't the same thing unless something in that system specifically confirms the second part, and I want to know exactly what Safety Sync does if an inspection cycle comes and goes without anyone actually certifying it complete. I want to be fair to what Safety Sync actually got right, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a grandson who'd stopped caring about the crew's climbing turbines the moment he moved from field maintenance into a technology leadership role. Safety Sync scheduling had genuinely eliminated the kind of missed or late paper log entries that had occasionally created real confusion under our old system, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering Jonas had built his early career around after 4 years himself as a junior turbine technician before moving into operations technology, and I never once doubted he believed in it completely, right down to personally reviewing every compliance discrepancy the system's dashboard generated. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of, was a default status logic that displayed gear as current based on the scheduled interval elapsing without a compliance failure being actively flagged, rather than requiring active, confirmed completion of an inspection before status could ever read as current, a distinction that meant a genuinely skipped inspection, one that simply never happened because the certified inspector wasn't available that week, could sit invisibly behind a status display that looked identical to gear that had actually been checked. Jonas had grown up spending summers on this coast, the same way I had myself decades earlier, and I remembered him as a boy of 9 or 10, sitting on the dock watching me pack gear before a shift, asking why I always checked things twice even when nothing looked wrong. I think that early curiosity, watching the actual physical discipline of this trade up close long before he ever touched a line of code, was part of why our disagreement over Safety Sync's blind spot never once felt, to either of us, like a fight about whether he understood what this work actually demanded. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that July morning, and because it's exactly the kind of status logic a compliance tracking system, built to manage schedules rather than confirm physical actions, was never designed to catch when the thing it was tracking simply didn't happen at all. Our crew carried exactly one certified fall arrest equipment inspector, a meticulous, well-respected technician named Astrid who'd held that specific certification for 9 years, and our standard inspection cycle ran every 6 weeks across the full crew's rotating equipment, a schedule Astrid had managed reliably the entire time Safety Sync had existed. 3 weeks before this story's events, Astrid had come down with a serious flu that kept her off the vessel for a full 9 days, spanning exactly the window during which that 6-week cycle's inspections were scheduled to occur, and because our contractor hadn't yet certified a backup inspector, that entire cycle's inspection simply never happened for roughly a third of the crew's equipment, including my own harness and lanyard. Safety Sync status logic, built around scheduled intervals rather than confirmed completion events, had no specific inspection skipped state built into its design, only a comparison between the current date and the date an item's status had last been marked current, and because my equipment's most recent confirmed inspection, 7 weeks earlier, still fell within a generous grace buffer the system's engineers had built in specifically to avoid flagging gear the moment a due date technically passed, the dashboard continued to display my harness as fully compliant straight through Astrid's illness and the missed cycle, with nothing on my tablet or the vessel's dispatch system ever indicating that the inspection itself simply hadn't occurred. I'd raised a version of this exact concern with Jonas nearly a year before this story's events, during Safety Sync's design review, specifically asking what would happen if an inspector became unavailable during a scheduled cycle. Safety Sync's grace buffer is built to prevent false compliance flags from minor scheduling delays, Grandpa. The system's designed around the assumption that inspections generally happen close to their scheduled interval. A full missed cycle is an edge case we hadn't specifically modeled a distinct status for. That's exactly the gap I'm worried about, Jonas. I want the system to require an inspector's active, logged sign-off before any item's status can read as current, full stop, rather than defaulting to current simply because a due date hasn't technically been exceeded yet. If Astrid's out sick and nobody else is certified to inspect, I want every technician's tablet showing an honest, visible warning that their gear's compliance status can't currently be confirmed, not a green checkmark that looks identical to gear that was actually checked. I remember leaving that design review understanding exactly where Jonas was standing, even as I disagreed with the conclusion he'd reached from there. He'd spent 4 years as a junior technician himself before he ever moved into operations technology, and I knew, better than almost anyone on this crew, how many genuinely frustrating hours he'd lost early in his career hunting down a missing paper log entry or reconstructing an inspection date from memory because somebody's handwriting had faded or a logbook page had gotten soaked on a rough crossing. He wasn't wrong that a clean digital schedule solved a real, well-documented problem, and I wasn't wrong that a schedule and a confirmation were two fundamentally different things that happened to look identical on a screen. The trouble was that neither of us, in that design review, had yet lived through the specific week that would finally force the two of us to weigh those competing truths against a genuinely frayed harness rather than a hypothetical question about an inspector's illness. The morning this story turns on was the 3rd week of July, my crew scheduled for routine maintenance on 3 turbines roughly 18 nautical miles offshore, my own harness and lanyard showing fully current on Safety Sync's dashboard as I boarded the transfer vessel, a status I'd have had every reason to trust completely if I hadn't developed, across 26 years, the specific habit of never once trusting a digital status alone regardless of how current it displayed. I ran my own physical inspection of my harness webbing and lanyard connection points on the vessel deck before we ever reached the first turbine, exactly as I did before every climb regardless of what any tablet showed, and felt it immediately, a section of webbing near the dorsal D-ring showing early, subtle fraying, the specific kind of wear pattern that a certified inspector's trained hands would have caught instantly but that Safety Sync schedule-based status had no way to know existed. Because the inspection that would have caught it had simply never happened. Jonas, this is Soren, my harness is showing current on Safety Sync, but I've got visible fraying near the dorsal D-ring that shouldn't be there if this gear had actually been inspected on schedule. I want to know exactly when Astrid's cycle 3 weeks ago was supposed to run, because I don't think this harness has been physically checked since well before that. Systems showing your last confirmed inspection 7 weeks ago, Grandpa, well within the grace window. If there's fraying, that's concerning, but the schedule itself looks compliant on our end. The schedule looking compliant and this webbing actually being inspected aren't the same thing, Jonas, and I'm telling you what my own hands are finding on this harness right now. I'm standing down from today's climb until every technician on this vessel has had their gear physically rechecked, whatever the dashboard happens to say about any of it. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell squarely within my formal authority as senior technician and, honestly, within the one rule every climber on this crew has followed since long before Safety Sync existed, that a technician's own physical inspection finding overrides any digital compliance status whenever the two genuinely diverge, full stop, regardless of how current or compliant any dashboard displayed. I called a full stand-down on that day's climbing operations, radioed the vessel captain to hold our position rather than proceeding to the first turbine, and had every technician on board pull their own personal equipment for an immediate visual inspection while we waited for a certified inspector to be brought out by launch from the mainland. The deck fell into a specific, focused quiet as gear came out of lockers and got laid across tarps for inspection, technicians working in pairs the way we'd all been trained, one person checking while the other read off the specific points to examine, webbing, stitching, D-rings, buckles, the whole practiced sequence considerably more careful and considerably slower than anyone's morning routine usually allowed for. 3 other technicians on that crew, once they knew specifically what to look for, found comparable were issues on gear that had also missed Astrid's skipped inspection cycle, equipment that had spent 3 weeks displaying as fully current on Safety Sync while nobody's hands had actually laid eyes on the physical condition of the webbing itself. The relief inspector arrived within 2 hours, running a full manual recertification of every piece of equipment that had fallen within the skipped cycles window, confirming my harness's fraying is serious enough to require immediate replacement rather than continued service, a finding that, had it gone undetected, could have meant a compromised fall arrest connection point on a climb 100 feet above open water. I stood on the transfer vessel's deck afterward with a technician named Ellen, one of the others whose gear had also been caught in the skipped cycle, both of us looking at our replaced harnesses laid out on the deck, still faintly able to see the fraying that had nearly gone completely unnoticed. 7 weeks showing current on the dashboard, and the actual inspection never happened for 3 of those weeks, Soren. If you hadn't run your own check before we ever left the dock, we're climbing turbines today on gear nobody's hands had actually verified. That's the whole problem I've been trying to explain to Jonas for a year, Ellen. A status that shows current based on a schedule isn't the same thing as a status that shows current because somebody actually confirmed it, and the two look identical on a screen right up until somebody's hands find out the difference. I documented every affected harness and lanyard, photographed the confirmed wear patterns alongside Safety Sync's original, current, status screenshots, and called Jonas directly rather than letting the full scope of the finding reach him secondhand through the normal chain. Jonas came out to the dock himself that evening, having heard enough over the phone to understand this wasn't a single piece of gear slipping through, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with 4 technicians worth of skipped inspections sitting in hard fact in front of both our eyes. For technicians' equipment showing fully current for 3 weeks it was never actually checked, Grandpa. That's not a marginal gap, that's exactly the scenario you described to me a year ago, sitting right here where I can finally see the full scope myself instead of dismissing it as an edge case we hadn't specifically modeled. I've been telling you a schedule-based status isn't the same thing as a confirmed inspection status since that design review, Jonas. I didn't have anything beyond a hypothetical question about Astrid getting sick until this morning made the gap impossible to keep deferring. This wasn't the system malfunctioning, it was doing exactly what its grace buffer was designed to do, avoid flagging gear over a minor scheduling delay. In exactly the one scenario where the delay wasn't minor at all, it was a full missed cycle with nobody certified to cover it. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe a year ago, when you first raised it at that design review. I wasn't dismissing you because I'd stopped trusting your judgment, Grandpa. I built Safety Sync because I spent 4 years as a junior technician watching paper logs get filled in late or inconsistently, and I genuinely believed a clean digital schedule solved that completely. I think I let myself believe a schedule that looked compliant was the same thing as gear that had actually been checked, right up until this morning showed me exactly how far apart those two things could get when one inspector's illness collided with a grace buffer nobody had stress-tested against a full missed cycle. I know that, Jonas. I'm not angry at you for wanting to fix genuinely messy paper logs. I filled out plenty of those myself before you ever built anything to replace them. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, a green checkmark on 4 technicians' tablets was asking this whole crew to trust gear that Astrid's illness had quietly left unverified for 3 full weeks, and the only reason we're standing here talking about a policy fix instead of a genuine tragedy is that 26 years taught me never to trust a status screen over what my own hands find on the actual webbing. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the 4 replaced harnesses laid out on the dock, and I watched him run the same calculation I imagined he'd been running since the full scope of the finding reached him, the particular engineer's math of how many other missed cycles, across 18 months and however many crews Safety Sync now managed, might have carried the same invisible phantom compliance gap without one technician's 26-year habit of checking his own gear happening to catch it in time. I keep thinking about the version of this morning where you trusted the dashboard and climbed without checking your own harness first, he said, finally, still looking at the gear on the dock, or the version where you'd stopped raising this at family dinners after I pushed back a year ago, because I outranked the argument on paper even if I'd spent 4 years as a junior technician myself before I ever built anything to replace the old logs. I don't like sitting with how much of this morning came down to you personally deciding a physical check couldn't ever become optional, no matter how current the dashboard said your gear was. I don't love sitting with that either, Jonas. A system this good shouldn't need one technician's stubborn habit of checking his own webbing as its last line of defense before somebody climbs 100 feet on a compromised connection point. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You built something genuinely good across 18 months, and I've never once told this crew otherwise, but genuinely good isn't the same as verified, and I think somewhere in that first year you let yourself believe a schedule that looked clean was the same thing as gear that had actually been checked. What Jonas and I built together over the following months, working with the compliance engineering team directly, was a redesigned status system requiring an inspector's active, logged confirmation before any equipment could display as current, replacing the schedule-based default entirely with an honest, inspection status unconfirmed, warning whenever a cycle passed without certified sign-off, alongside a standing requirement that at least 2 technicians per crew maintain current inspector certification specifically to prevent a single person's illness from ever again leaving an entire cycle uncovered. I still physically inspect my own gear before every single climb, exactly as I did the season before Safety Sync existed and exactly as I will the season after whatever eventually replaces it, though Ellen, I've noticed, now teaches that exact habit to every new technician joining the crew unprompted, a lesson she picked up, she told me once, specifically from that July morning. Jonas and I talk about Safety Sync's ongoing refinement most Sundays now, at the same family dinner table he's been sitting at since he was a boy, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that July climb. He told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't the redesign itself, it was sitting with how completely 18 clean months had let him trust a schedule-based status as equivalent to a confirmed one, right up until his own grandfather's habit of checking his own harness finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. A safety harness doesn't care what a calendar says about it, only what actually happened to the webbing since somebody's hands last checked it, and what I've learned, watching a system my own grandson built get this one thing wrong for a year before finally getting it right, is that the most dangerous gap in a genuinely well-built system is often the one sitting quietly in the difference between a schedule and a confirmation. 2 things that look identical on a screen right up until an inspector's illness, a grace buffer, and 3 missed weeks finally show you exactly how far apart they'd always actually been. It took a frayed harness, a full crew stand down, and a grandfather and grandson who trusted each other enough to argue honestly across a family dinner table a year before it mattered, to finally close a gap that 18 otherwise excellent months of engineering had never quite found their way to on their own.